Can you use ChatGPT to come up with a glaze recipe? And should you use ChatGPT to come up with a glaze recipe? This is something I've seen a lot of potters playing with over the last year or two, and I have my opinions on this, but I'd like to explore it more in this video. My short answer is that you can and shouldn't, and I'll explain why I think that over the course of this video. I don't know the audience for this video. Normally I make pottery videos specifically for potters, and they are the only people who see it. Because this intersects with ChatGPT, it's quite possible YouTube will send this to a wider audience. So if you're here having watched none of my other videos, then hi, I'm Joe. I'm a potter working out of the south of the UK, and my work focuses largely on glazes. I do a lot of experimenting with glaze chemistry, so I have my opinions on this, and I've been keeping an eye on the development of ChatGPT and what it can and can't do. I'll explore all that in this video. I'll start with an explanation of what a glaze is, in case anyone is coming into this somewhat familiar with ChatGPT but not at all familiar with a glaze. And even, to be honest, if you're a potter, this way of looking at glazes might not be an approach that you'd seen before. So I'll cover what a glaze is and how I conceptualize them, and then I'll explain to the best of my ability what a large language model is and what it's doing when it gives you an answer, and then we will put ChatGPT to the test. What is a glaze? Essentially, a glaze is a thin coating of glass that covers a ceramic piece to make it waterproof and durable. The chemistry for a glaze has to be quite specific in terms of the range of possible glasses you can make, because not only does it have to be a stable glass in its own right, but it has to match the characteristics of the pot that it's placed on. You want the thermal expansion and things like that to match, so the two of them become one fused piece, which doesn't create any undue stress. And then the chemistry of the glass has to be such that it is stable on its own and won't kind of disintegrate when you use it. So there's quite a narrow range of the possible chemistries that will actually work for our purposes. The specifics matter quite a lot. When thinking about a glaze, there are a few broad categories of ingredients. The most basic is the glass former, which in our case is silica from silicon dioxide. That forms the bulk of the glass in our glaze. There are other glass formers, but typically we use silica. If you could just melt silica in a normal kiln, which you can't, it requires significantly higher temperatures, it would just run straight off the pot. So you also need a stabilizer. In our case, we use aluminium or alumina. Both of these melt at too high a temperature for our kilns. So we have two types of flux, the alkaline metal fluxes and the alkaline earth fluxes, which need to be in the glaze in an appropriate ratio. The specifics of which one of them you pick changes some characteristics of the glaze, but broadly speaking, you can pick a number from one category and a number from the other and just make sure they are chemically balanced when looking at the kind of underlying molecular chemistry of the glaze, which we'll come to in a minute, and that will give your glaze the ability to melt, but also some stability. That balance is important. Those are your four ingredient classes if you're firing at what we refer to as cone 10, which is about 1,300 degrees centigrade. A lot of smaller kilns don't fire as hot as that. They only go to maybe 1,200, which would be considered cone 6. The cone is a reference to a physical thing that melts within the firing and gives you an indication of how well fired it is. I've got another post about them which I will link to if you're interested, but broadly speaking it's just a way of measuring the total amount of heat that went into the kiln. So cone 10 is hotter than cone 6. We're going to be looking at cone 6 glazes today because that's what I work at. To bring a cone 10 recipe down to cone 6, you would typically add boron. Boron melts at a lower temperature and brings the melting temperature of a glaze down. The more boron you have in a glaze, the lower the temperature it will melt at, making it a very convenient fifth class of ingredients when working at lower temperatures. You've got your glass former, your stabilizer, your fluxes, and then some boron. 5 categories, and you can pick 5 ingredients and make a recipe using those 5 ingredients in different ratios to achieve different things, but broadly speaking they have to be within a range for a glaze to be stable and melt at the right temperature. You can then add other things to it, particularly this top row of the transition metals. They are colorants by and large, so you'll get different colors with them. Chromium's green, iron's typically red, cobalt's blue. A glaze recipe is structured such that, let's pick a straightforward one, the gloss base. So this is a straightforward recipe. You have your 5 base ingredients. There's a little bit of bentonite, but that just keeps the glaze in suspension. So that's more for the studio properties so that you can more easily apply it to a pot. So we can ignore that, and you're just looking at your 5 ingredients. This is how a glaze recipe is structured, where you have ingredients in the base which total 100%, and then additional ingredients like bentonite or colorants adding up to more than 100%. That's not a perfect representation of how you should conceptualize the chemistry in a recipe, but it's a very convenient way to write out the recipes, because typically these base ingredients are somewhere in the 5 to 50% range, depending on which ones you're picking. I mean, obviously here it goes from 15% to 30%, and then the colorants are much smaller. You typically only need a couple of percent. And also you could have a base recipe like this, which is just a generic glossy cone 6 glaze, and you could add different colorants to it to achieve a different result. So far so straightforward. What you might notice here is that only one of the ingredients is the broad category that I mentioned, silica. We need a silica source, and that is referred to as silica. Kaolin is not a pure alumina source. Nepheline cyanide is not a pure single flux source from the alkaline metals. Whiting is actually a single source of an alkaline earth, but comes with an unusual name. And then the Frit is the boron source, but that comes with other things. While you have the 5 broad categories of ingredient, each one of them has complexity to it, potentially, because they are either mined, like nepheline cyanide and kaolin, that's the form that they are dug out of the ground, or the Frit is a man-made powdered ingredient that has a specific chemistry, but they're not just bringing the element we need, they're bringing multiple things. Part of the difficulty of looking at a list of ingredients and understanding a glaze recipe is that each of the ingredients will bring multiple things. You need to take each ingredient apart to examine what it provides in a glaze, total each of the 5 categories, and put them in balance with each other. It's difficult to do just looking at the words themselves. You can get a rough idea if you know what each thing has in it, but even then it's quite tricky, which is where we've got this amazing tool called Unity Molecular Formula, or UMF, which does exactly that. So what we've got here is each ingredient, then the amount of silica, alumina, boron, sodium, potassium, magnesium, calcium that it provides. So each ingredient will provide some of these categories. And as I said, you can see silica is actually just a pure silica source. Kaolin provides some alumina, but also some silica and then trace amounts of other things. Whiting is just a calcium source. The Frit, while it does bring in the boron, which nothing else brings in, it also has silica and alumina and some of each type of flux. So there is this complexity to each ingredient where it is very difficult to just look at the ingredients and see the underlying chemistry unless you have them all programmed into a UMF calculator, which not only does it take them apart so that you can see what proportion of each category is within an ingredient, it also uses the molecular weight of them, where larger elements you get fewer of them per mass. A kilo of one ingredient doesn't necessarily mean it's got the same number of particles as a kilo of another ingredient, so you have to take that into account as well. UMF does all of that, then it puts them into proportion with each other. The fluxes add up to 1, so you've got 0.3 and 0.7, they add together to make 1, and then everything else is put into proportion with those, and it is a way of looking at glazes to understand the underlying chemistry of them. If you haven't encountered that before, that's a lot to take in, but there's a couple of things I want you to take away from this. First is the generic form of a recipe. So just remember, you're looking for a handful of ingredients with percentages that add up to 100, and then possibly additional ingredients adding up to more than 100%. But that's kind of the ingredients you'd expect to see in a recipe, a Cone 6 recipe, and the rough proportions of them. So that's the form of the recipe. Next, remember that there are 5 categories of ingredient. You can have duplicates from a category, but when you break down the chemistry, they all go into the same kind of buckets. So if you had 3 versions of a frit, you would want the total to still come to the same total, so you'd need less of them. There you've got your categories of ingredients, and what you want is the total when you pull them all apart and use the UMF to look at them, the total to be the number that you want it to be. And then the most important thing is that even if you know what you're looking for, it is very hard to look at a glaze recipe, just the words of a glaze recipe, and see what that glaze is going to do. Let's talk about what ChatGPT is. So ChatGPT is a large language model, and a large language model is what we're calling AI at the moment. It has been fed all of the written text that they have been able to get their hands on, and with that written text, it has pulled it apart and analyzed it for trends and patterns, and the system now has the ability to generate novel text using the patterns that it discovered in the text that it was given. It's then trained by humans to output the best possible text according to those humans, which probably is just the most plausible human sounding text. It's not necessarily judged on accuracy. Because it is generating novel text, it can generate completely new things that may or may not be a correct answer to the question you ask it. Because it has been trained to deliver confident human-sounding replies, that's what you get when you ask it a question. So it sounds like it knows what it's talking about. Often the answer will be correct, but equally it might not be. And ChatGPT will not tell you whether or not it is correct. Sometimes it will admit that it doesn't know what it's talking about, but it doesn't know that it doesn't know what it's talking about. You can get it to do that even on factually correct things that it said, just because it's been trained to give an appropriate response. And if you tell it that it's wrong, it might just concede that point even if it isn't. From our perspective, the important thing is it will generate plausible text with absolute confidence, and it's up to you to verify that text and see whether or not it's a correct answer to the question you asked it, which some of the time it will be and some of the time it won't be. With glazes, it becomes even more tricky because obviously there's that level of underlying complexity. Now, obviously, it's had enough glaze recipes in its training data that it can generate them, and I will show you this now. That's interesting. It branched out more than I expected it to. When you ask it for a Cone 6 recipe, it will generate a novel one. I've never got the same answer twice. I initially thought it would be generating, almost copy and pasting a generic recipe, because there are some very well-known, common recipes that you would find, and I always expected that it would just copy those. Broadly speaking, whenever I ask it for one, it does. But in this case, it's actually added more ingredients and some uncommon ones, like barium carbonate. Not many people use barium unless there's a good reason for it. It is more toxic than most of the other ingredients, which isn't a problem unless you're eating your glaze. So, like, as long as you're practicing the typical safety within the studio, that shouldn't be a problem. But barium is generally avoided just because you don't need it. Just ask it for 5 ingredients. See what we get this time. That's more like it. Okay, so that's typically what you'd expect. So it's got your silica, you've got your alumina, you've got your 2 fluxes, and you've got a boron source. Now that actually looks like a fairly decent Cone 6 glaze. I have in the past, I've got some screenshots of some absolutely terrible glazes that it gave me with this generic prompt. That one's actually pretty good. As I said, like, you can't tell. I should say as well, this website that I'm looking at here, this is Glaze, and this is a fantastic website. It's full of glaze recipes, but it also has this glaze calculator where you can create a recipe and it will give you the chemical analysis of it. If you had an AI that was numerically competent and programmed built into this, then it would give you much better answers. That's in the right ballpark. That's in the right ballpark. That's in the right ballpark. That is actually a surprisingly good glaze recipe, given some of the awful ones it served up on its first test in the past. Everything seems nicely in proportion there. Let's ask it. Right, so now I've asked it for the 5 ingredients that I use in my first 5 glaze recipes. So my idea is to use the most generic, consistent, and broadly available ingredients to make a bunch of different bases. So let's see if it gives me something similar to any of the recipes I've got. Yeah, again, that looks plausible. So it's doing well so far. It's quite possible if I changed which version of it, you'd get better or worse responses. I actually would have said that it was getting worse over time as I tested it again, but this seems to be doing well today. I'm not sure how you jump from the good to the bad result. It seems quite hit and miss. Anyway, again, another solid looking recipe. I'd imagine if I stuck those numbers into Glaze, actually let's just do it. Those sensible flux ratio, possibly a bit less silica and alumina than you would like. The further it gets down into that corner, the more it crazes, and that's, you've got silica on that axis, alumina on that axis, so you want to be kind of up there-ish. That's because it's got quite a lot of whiting, and you could quite easily drop that to 15 and add another 5 kaolin, and then you've got a more stable recipe. But you know what it gave us will be slightly more fluid, slightly more prone to crazing, but probably fine. Where it gets interesting is when you start forcing it to go outside of its comfort zone. If we ask it to give us a food safe cone 6 glaze recipe, we'll start with the glass forms. So we're going to ask it to give us a recipe using silica, and then another name for silica. So these are 3 different names for the same ingredient, essentially. In the UK, we tend to use quartz and flint fairly interchangeably for our main silica source. In the States, they generally refer to it as silica, which can be quite confusing when glaze recipes come over here, because we have silica sand, which is a much coarser, literally sandy particle, like you've just taken sand from a beach, which has a different purpose in pottery. But these 3 words essentially all allude to the same ingredient. When you ask it to give you a recipe that does that, I actually ignored, it's rolled silica and flint into one thing, but it's given us a recipe that is 60% silica and has no boron in it whatsoever, and barely has, it doesn't, once you put 60% silica in, you don't have enough room for fluxes. So for comparison, we're going to keep my slightly modified version of its first recipe, and let's give ourselves a new one. You can see on the map, we have fallen off the edge of the map. That green bound shows how far Derek thought any glaze would fall within. The idea of this map is it's showing you matte is the green band up here, because there's not very much silica, and that, I won't go into it, but that green band over there is matte because of the glaze chemistry. All the glossy ones will be found in this middle clear band. This darker area down here is where you would expect a glaze to be crazed, which means it cracks, and that's because the glaze shrinks more than the clay. And you've probably seen pots that have that. Sometimes it's done deliberately, sometimes it's done accidentally. It's quite hard to avoid on any work that's going to see repeated heating and cooling, just because that creates expansion and contraction stress. But down in this bottom corner you get more stress because the glaze wants to shrink more. So generally speaking, you want to be in that sort of ballpark like that first recipe was. You have increasing silica, and this has fallen so far off the edge that it's actually outside the drawn part of the map. There is so much silica in relation to those fluxes that, this green line here is the under fired, will not melt kind of line. So with that much silica in, there isn't enough flux to melt it, particularly with no boron in it. There's just no hope of that being a glossy cone 6 glaze. You can't put 60% silica in a glaze and expect it to melt. The thing is, ChatGPT does not understand that. Now what you could do, we'll use my actual instructions. We'll add Oh, it's not going to let me add flint as a separate thing. Okay, what about quartz? Nope. Glaze knows that silica, flint and quartz are the same thing, so it actually won't let me do it. But for the sake of demonstrating this, we will have 3 silicas. If someone came to me and said, make a glaze recipe with silica, quartz and flint, even if I didn't know what they were, I could put them into Glaze, and assuming it would even let me put them in as separate things, which obviously in this case it won't, they would all be chemically identical. We're looking at a perfectly normal recipe that has 25% silica. We could just have 10% quartz, 10% flint, 5% silica. Doesn't matter which we do because they're all identical. Now we're at a sensible sort of level. We only total 65%, so we'd have to bring the others up to sensible levels. There, that's fine. So we got slightly different because we're using Custer instead of Nephilim, but fine. We've used 3 sources of silica, and what we've done is we've decreased the amount so that it makes sense. ChatGPT has not done this. In fact, it didn't even bother using 3 sources. It only used 2 sources, and it still put them at 60%. And it might explain, it's got an explanation of ingredients. It knows to type out in words that silica and quartz are the same thing and what silica does. And it knows what these ones are bringing. And then it will tell you it is generally food safe when properly fired at cone 6. There is no way that is true. Glaze results should result in a clear to slightly off white glossy finish. Now, what I'm going to do later on in the video is I'm going to make these glazes and I'm going to show you what that would look like, but we will do it again. So please give me a glossy food safe cone 6 recipe. I could ask for 3 different clay types, so rather than just asking for EPK, which is a kaolin, you could ask for kaolin, ball clay and grollig. Those are 3 different types of clay. They have slightly different levels of impurities and slightly different silica to alumina ratios and things like that, but broadly speaking they are identical. It will, oh well, let's just do it, and it will do almost certainly do the same thing. Yep, there we go. 60% EPK, grollig, kaolin. And look, it's the form of a recipe. If you didn't know what those ingredients did, you go, what a convenient, straightforward recipe. I asked for a glossy cone 6 recipe. It has given me something that looked exactly like a glaze recipe. It's only got 1 flux. It's got 60% kaolin, or 60% clay rather, 20% silica, 1 flux. That is going to be comically undermelted. That is actually undermelted as a clay body, let alone as a glaze. There's no chance of that working. We will do it again with the fluxes. So let's say Nephilim, potash. So feldspars are rocks that are, well, in fact all 3 of these are rocks that are dug up and ground up, and potash and soda refer to whether it's primarily potassium or sodium. Nephilim cyanite is a feldspathoid. It's similar to a feldspar, but not quite, doesn't quite meet the criteria. But broadly speaking, the 3 identical ingredients. And here we've got 75% of those ingredients. Let's put that in. So here we are actually quite high up, and that is because all the feldspars bring with them quite a lot of other parts of rock. So they all have some silica and some alumina with them, where the whiting is purely calcium. From the chemistry perspective, it's calcium carbonate. The carbon burns off during the firing, leaving you with pure calcium. Meaning if you had 60% whiting, you'd be down here, because that wouldn't bring any silica or alumina. Because we've got 75% feldspars, we've actually got quite a lot of glass former and stabilizer. It'd be interesting to see what that does. That recipe there is a snowflake crackle, and you get a snowflake crackle by essentially having that. If you went something like 90%, we've gone high enough in terms of silica and alumina with that recipe that it gave us. It actually possibly might not run, definitely not going to be food safe, but I'm intrigued to see what it does actually do. But yes, you get that pattern because you've got extreme shrinkage in a kind of matte-ish glaze, but that's a very extreme glaze, and you wouldn't use that to be durable. It does work and produces really cool result. It's a pain to work with for studio problems. So the glaze gels in the bucket and you can't get it onto the pot, and if you do get it onto the pot, you've got to get it on so thick that it then crawls back off the pot and falls off before you get it into the kiln. If you can get it on thick enough and fire it, it's this amazing glaze where you've got layers of crazing that create this intricate pattern that I absolutely love, but it's never been worth the effort to work with, in my opinion. Let's just round out the set. So we will ask it to do one using whiting, dolomite, elastanoite. So these are calcium source, and a calcium source with a little bit of magnesium in there. Again, 3 duplicate ingredients. A human would know not to put them all in at the same percentage. Here we're up at 70%, just those ingredients. So as I said, once you've got a lot of these 3, which don't bring, well actually elastanoite brings a little bit of silica in, but broadly speaking, they only bring flux in. Once you put the silica in proportion to the flux, turns out, I've never seen a flux ratio like that before. You're aiming for 0.3 to 0.7 is pretty good. Around 30% from your sodium and potassium, and around 70% from calcium, magnesium, that lot. In this particular one, we've got so little castor and so much of the 3 calcium sources that we're up to 0.02 and 0.98. Never seen that in a glaze before. I will make that and apply it to a pot and we will see what that does. And then our last one to try is we'll do the same. We will ask Frit 3134. So these are man-made frits that use slightly different chemistry. And then there's a naturally occurring mineral which is mined in the US and is no longer mined. It's just not viable commercially and no one can be bothered, which is a shame because it's a very useful ingredient. But all 3 of these provide a decent amount of boron, which is what they're used for in glazes. Again, you want a small amount of boron to keep everything in proportion with everything else. What it has done is it has given us 65% boron source, and we will stick that into here. So what have we got? So this one is way down here and with something like 2 to 3 times the amount of boron that it would want, even if it had enough alumina in it, which it doesn't because it hasn't included any clay. So there's no alumina source in here, just a trace amount coming from a few different things like the castor. So we have, again, an absolute monstrosity of a glaze recipe. It hasn't understood that there are 3 duplicate ingredients. I would not expect it to necessarily, although the worst part is that it will tell you that you've got a similar fluxing frit to a source of boron. You know, it knows that those 3 are the same. It can type out the text explaining what each of them does, and it just doesn't apply the words that it says, which shouldn't be a surprise when you know that it's a word prediction engine rather than an intelligent being creating a sensible output. But we'll get into that in a second. The next step is to mix up the glaze tests. Mixing up a glaze is really easy. It's like baking without the baking, just weighing out the ingredients and then you're done. So if you can bake a cake, you are overqualified to mix up a glaze. Glaze recipes are expressed as a percentage rather than as a weight, which confuses some people, but it's a percentage of the amount you'd like to mix up. So in this particular case, I'm mixing up 50 grams. It's enough to dip a test towel, but not so much that I waste a bunch of materials, which means that everything is a percentage of 50 grams. Now I find that 100% water is generally a good starting point for most glazes. This will vary, but as a rule of thumb, that's where I start. So I put 50 grams of water into a pot and then I weigh out all the ingredients. So for example, an ingredient that was in the recipe at 20% would be 20% multiplied by 50 grams, which would give you 10 grams. So I'd weigh out 10 grams. Here I am weighing everything sequentially into the same container, which I generally wouldn't recommend. All of our materials are white powders that are very difficult to distinguish, and if you're putting them on top of each other and you put too much of one in, it can be very difficult to get just that one back out, or at least to know for certain that's what you've done. The way I'm doing it here is I level off the materials that are in the pot and then I put the new one in over to the side, forming a pile. If I do overshoot, which I generally aim not to, I know that I can take a little off the top of the pile and there's no chance of it being contaminated. Then once it's at the correct amount, I level it off and put the next ingredient. What I would recommend doing most of the time is weighing out the ingredients in a smaller container, and then once you've weighed the right amount of that ingredient, you tip it into the larger container. That way there's no chance of accidentally putting too much in and then contaminating that ingredient when you take some back out. Once you've weighed out all of your ingredients, what you do is you add them to the water, mix them up, then pass it through a sieve. After that, you can dip your test tiles in. Because the recipe with the 3 clays is much closer to a clay body than a glaze, I am treating it as a clay body rather than as a glaze, and I'm turning it into a little Lego minifig and some test tiles instead. With that much clay, it would probably not apply at all to a test tile. It would just flake and crawl off as it shrank while it was drying, and it definitely wouldn't fire like a glaze, so I'm not going to treat it as one. I said before about how bentonite keeps the glaze in suspension. So does clay when added as a material, as well as being an alumina source. So a good recipe will either have 10 to 20% clay and or 1 to 2% bentonite in the recipe. Without anything like that, the glaze will fall out of suspension pretty quickly. And I believe this happened to the frit test tile, the one with 3 frits in. The glaze looks like it's on there much thinner than it should be. I weigh the application by zeroing scales on the test tiles before dipping and then weighing it afterwards to see how much the weight is increased. But this only works if the glaze is staying uniformly in suspension, the glaze has fallen to the bottom and it's only taking up water. You get a much thinner application, which I believe is what happened there. So glazes should include bentonite. I didn't adjust the recipes to account for that. Maybe I should have for a fairer test of exactly how they would behave if applied correctly. But on the other hand, this is a good representation of what it would be like if you tried to use a ChatGPT recipe in the studio. We have our fired results. This middle one, this glossy, clear, you can see the clay clearly through it, and it's nice and flat, smooth, glossy. That's the control. That's my glossy base recipe. Just a really generic, middle of the road glossy glaze. We've got a range of results here, as expected. So there are 2 that are very overfired, and you can see how much they've run down the test tile, but also how thin they are at the top. They've done some interesting things because there's a lot of boron in there, and boron will behave interestingly at high concentrations. So that isn't a reflection. The glaze has actually gone white because of the amount of boron in it, but it's really thin at the top and it's blistered, and that's a sign of overfiring. And this was the generic recipe with 50% frit in. This one actually, it's done something kind of cool on that side, but this was the other really high frit recipe, and again, as you can see there, blistered because there's too much boron. Completely overfired for this temperature. That recipe could be fired about 200 degrees colder and would still melt. Completely inappropriate for what we requested. This one, you've got slight gloss. You can see from the way the drip is preserved from the application, it's only just beginning to melt, and it's crazing, which I'm not surprised about. But that's the one with too much feldspar. And then you have this hideous monstrosity, which I don't know if it applied like that or if it's blistered. I'm not quite sure what it's done there, but that's the one with too much carbonate, so loads of calcium in it. Not at all a glossy cone 6 glaze. And the one with loads of silica, also completely underfired. You can see the drips preserved from the application, where if it had melted that would have flowed down into it. It's matte, but it's not matte because of the underlying chemistry. It's matte because it's underfired. And then at the most extreme we have this. This minifig is made using what ChatGPT said would be a glossy cone 6 glaze. It actually is an underfired clay. There wasn't enough fluxing power in it to vitrify the clay even, but that's a clay body, that's not a glaze. And I used the remaining clay to make other little test tiles. So these ones have a completely underfired glaze on a completely underfired clay, both of which ChatGPT thought would be a glossy cone 6 glaze. So the results are as we would have guessed from the chemistry, and not at all what ChatGPT said they were going to be. One other thing that I've seen people use ChatGPT for with regards to glaze recipes is substituting materials. You could take a recipe like Borealis and you could say you wanted to replace this boron source for a frit. That is something that it is possible to do. You have to adjust the levels of everything else, because as discussed, each ingredient comes with a degree of complexity that has to be accounted for in the chemistry, and ChatGPT seems like it's capable of doing that. In previous versions of this, I'd asked it to replace with Frit 3134, but they are similar options, which is a good reason you might want to swap them, but means that ChatGPT can actually get away with just not doing anything. It just puts it in and maybe moves a couple of ingredients by 1% and says, there, I've done it. And the answer isn't that far off. In order to force it to do something more interesting, we're going to use a frit that varies in its chemistry more, and we will ask it to replace it and see what it does. I'm going to screenshot this, and this is one area that ChatGPT is actually very good. You can give it the screenshot and it will interpret the recipe from the screenshot, which, is quite remarkable, really. We're going to ask it to swap the two and keep the chemistry the same, and it should be able to understand the question and act on it. It's made some changes. We'll stick that in, see what we get. You can see there that the flux ratio has changed. The boron level is 2/3 of what it should be. There's too much silica, too much alumina. They're in approximately the same ratios because it didn't adjust that. You can see on the map, we're up here, we want to be down there. The way Derek set up this map, the dots represent the position with regards to silica and alumina. The color of the dot represents the flux ratio. It's just based on those two colors. So red means you've got more alkaline metal and blue means you've got more alkaline earth. I believe white is 0.3 to 0.7. And then that outer ring shows you how much boron, although you can't really tell the difference between the two. That one has more boron. So it's not done a great job. It would still work as a glaze, but it's not going to look like that one because pretty much every characteristic of it is different. Glaze has got a built-in calculator called Target and Solve. I believe this is only if you're a Patreon, so this is actually a premium feature. I am a patron, not for any of the additional things, just because Glaze is such a great resource. I think it's worth supporting. But one advantage is you get the Target and Solve, so I can click that, and what it's doing is it's now targeting this recipe. You can tell it you want to change to 3124, and you can either toggle on or off add generic materials. For the sake of fairness, because ChatGPT didn't add any new ingredients, I will tell it not to add any new ingredients. And then you see the dot there is that one. When we click solve, that dot is going to move down as close as possible to that. It won't be able to get it exactly right because it's not adding any generic ingredients, but it's pretty close. And then down here, it will tell you you've got too much silica, a bit too much boron, not enough magnesium because there's no source of magnesium. And what we can do if we wanted it to be perfect is you can let it add generic materials and then it just matches exactly to the point that it doesn't even have what elements are higher and lower because it's got it spot on. It has been able to exactly match the chemistry because it is possible. Even without the generic materials, it's much closer. ChatGPT did not get close, and this maintains the balance of those. That is not true. They are all different. It hasn't managed to match the chemistry, but it doesn't know that. You can make it harder for it by giving it more challenging ingredients. From my experience, that is basically what it does. When you ask it to do a replacement, it moves the numbers a tiny bit. If you then tell it it's wrong, just look at that answer. It gives the outward appearance of having really thought hard about this, gone away, calculated it, come back with a correct answer. What it's actually done is it's adjusted that by 0.5%, and that by, what did it give us before? 28. So it's moved the silica down to 27. It's moved the kaolin down to 4.5. What else has it changed? Nothing. So that won't affect the boron at all because the boron is in proportion to the fluxes and it didn't change the fluxes. And this is where ChatGPT is so dangerous, is that it looks so capable. The fact that it can import an image and understand a natural language question about the image, understand that the image is showing you a glaze recipe, pull out the glaze recipe, and then use that to inform the answer that it gives that gives you such depth of background knowledge while still not being able to do the calculation properly is why so many people have been fooled into thinking that it's capable of doing this, but it just isn't. The harder the question you give it, the more wrong it will be. I've managed to get it before. If you tell it it's wrong, it starts doing things like putting minus amounts of silica in. So at one time it told me to put minus 11% silica. Not the most practical of glaze recipes. ChatGPT appears capable of substituting ingredients, but it is very much not. And you will only know this if you know how to check its workings with something like Glaze, and then you need to understand what all those numbers are telling you. A beginner wouldn't know how to check ChatGPT's workings and wouldn't know when it was going wrong, which makes it pretty useless for a beginner. This leads us to the question of what ChatGPT and large language models are actually good for when it comes to ceramics, but also in general. From my experience and from what I've read and listened to, I would have to say they are very good at generating content of a mediocre but somewhat unique nature. And so the way I kind of think about it is, if I was making something like a video game and I wanted 1,000 recipes to be essentially placeholder, to go in the background, having a recipe book in your game and you want to fill it with recipes so there's something there, but you don't actually care what the recipes are or whether or not they work, then it's perfect for that. It can generate 1,000 recipes in no time at all, take you forever to write them by hand. It's an absolute no-brainer. Use ChatGPT for that. Perfect. If you're cooking dinner, you don't want 1,000 recipes that may or may not be any good. You want one tried and tested recipe that is going to produce a good plate of food. And you can't guarantee that with any large language model generated recipe. They don't understand the nuances in baking. They don't understand the nuances in glaze recipes. They can generate novel text that has the outward appearance of what you're looking for. It's easy to be duped by that until it intersects with an area that you know well enough that you can actually judge the quality of its output. I could ask ChatGPT to write me an article on a subject I knew very little about and be very impressed with its output. But when I ask it to write an article on something I do know something about, it's got a surface level understanding, and often it will be wrong. We all know about the hallucinations. It'll just make stuff up. It outputs something, but it doesn't output at the level that you would want for the majority of use cases, and that applies to everything in ceramics as well. You're not looking for 1,000 novel, potentially useless recipes. What you're really looking for is a single recipe that meets exactly your criteria. Glaze is a fantastic resource. There are thousands and thousands of recipes, and these are human-created recipes that have been tested. They have been fired in kilns. If you pick a recipe, this is, I believe, from John Britt's book. So I posted the recipe, but it's not one of my original recipes. Here it is, that's my fired results. And then you've got all of these results from other humans who have tested it in their kilns. And so you can be fairly confident that this recipe will work quite well for you if you're firing in the same conditions. If ChatGPT gives you a recipe, you have no idea. I mean, obviously you can test it yourself, but why? The only reason that a pre-existing recipe like this wouldn't work for you is that you have a specific criteria that you want to meet. You wanted to have a recipe that exactly matched the color you wanted, and that is a very specialist thing that you would have to probably work quite hard to achieve, or you would have to talk to someone who really knew their glaze chemistry, and ChatGPT would give the outward appearance of someone who knew that. You could ask it for a very specific question like that. As previously mentioned, the more specific your question, the more specifically wrong ChatGPT will be, because it just does not have the understanding of the chemistry, or when you're asking a specific question, the depth of knowledge to pull from to recycle someone else's answer from its training data. So it's okay for generic recipes. The more specifically precise you get with your requests for it, the more wrong it will be. And I can't see any use case for it where it is preferable to the existing alternative. If you don't care specifically what you want, a recipe from Glaze will do. And if you have a very specific set of instructions, ChatGPT is not capable of following them anyway. You will be much better off, and this is unfortunately a more expensive and long-winded way to go about it, but taking a ceramic materials workshop class to really understand what's going on in the chemistry. You can bounce your questions off Matt, and he does know the underlying chemistry and can help you solve it or point you in the right direction to solve it, but also it gives you the tools to look at something like this and understand what's going on and know what you need to do to adjust things yourself. ChatGPT, unfortunately, while it gives the outward appearance of something that can solve that problem, is just not capable of it. Given that it can't do this, and it actually can't do many things very well at a high enough level to replace a competent human doing it, why so much money and so much time has been spent on them? My understanding is that there's a couple of factors that have gone into it. Really what it comes down to is essentially FOMO and not having any better ideas. From the perspective of a company like Google, they have the money to throw at a challenge like this. To a certain extent, it doesn't matter whether or not large language models live up to the hype. Firstly, obviously there's the hype. Google benefit from the hype cycle in terms of investment, but really what they don't want is to be the equivalent of that Microsoft executive who said that no one would buy the iPhone, and that's why Windows weren't making a phone. You don't want to be the only one who didn't go in for a new technology at the very start and be stuck trying to catch up or just having to give up on that technology. Google and Apple and Meta all throwing money at it, because if it doesn't pan out in the same way that blockchain didn't pan out after the hype cycle, all the companies that started putting all of their things on the blockchain and quietly reversed that when no one cared anymore, they haven't lost out other than a little bit of money. But if it had been the next big thing, they would have been primed to make the most of it. So you've got all these companies throwing money at it on the basis that if it works, great, there'll be a forerunner. And if it doesn't work, everyone else has spent money on it and Google will be fine even if this doesn't pan out. Now, I dawdled over making this video. This has been something I've been kind of thinking about for about 2 years at this point, having periodically tested ChatGPT to see if it could do anything with glazes. I've managed to time it well enough that I haven't finished recording the video before DeepSeek launched. In the last couple of days, this has thrown a spanner in the works for all of the American companies producing large language models. From my understanding of DeepSeek, it is a serious problem for those companies developing very expensive, very high-end large language models, because DeepSeek is so much cheaper and so much smaller, easier to run, open source, so you can download it and run it locally on basic hardware rather than needing the specialist chip, and so on and so forth. From our perspective, it doesn't actually change anything. DeepSeek is not more powerful or more capable than ChatGPT, which means that the answers it gives to very specific Glaze questions are no better. I'm sure they could be better at Glaze suggestions if they were trained specifically on that data and it was refined, and maybe the fact that you can download DeepSeek and train it to a certain extent yourself, people will create better Glaze calculators from it, but I'm not sure anyone's going to bother. I know Derek at Glaze ran a whole project a few years ago using generative AI before it was more publicly available. I'll link that in the description. He's already done it and he's trained it on the Glaze database. I don't know if the results he got were more coherent. It's quite possible that it was no better, but it was curated by someone who knows what they're talking about. I'm not entirely sure. I don't see that DeepSeek is going to be an improvement from our perspective, at least not as far as glazes are concerned. Now, I had a few other questions posed to me when I said that I was making this video. A lot of people talked about prompt engineering. So I haven't heard so much about this recently. This was a very big thing when ChatGPT started. Lots of people were talking about prompt engineering as a way of getting more precise answers or controlling what output you got from the large language model, because they are a little unpredictable as to what kind of quality of output you get. There are people who were suggesting that you can prompt a large language model to be a Glaze chemist. That's the general gist of prompt engineering, or seems to be. You tell it that it's got to answer in the style of. So people suggest saying, answer in the style of a Glaze chemist or a Glaze expert, hoping that that outputs a better output. Now, as we have seen from this substitution, it is capable of answering in what very much appears to be the output of a specialist, someone who very intricately knows all the details of the thing they're talking about. My counter argument to that is that asking it to answer in the style of does exactly what you ask it to, in the style of. You can ask it to answer in the style of William Shakespeare, and it will do that. William Shakespeare doesn't know anything about Glaze chemistry. It'll give you the same underlying calculation, but just in a different language. And if asking it to answer in the style of William Shakespeare doesn't give you William Shakespeare's level of Glaze understanding, why do you think asking it to answer in the style of a Glaze specialist changes its underlying knowledge? It's not limited in the quality of its calculation by the type of person it's attempting to embody. And so asking for something specific like that, unfortunately, doesn't work. I would be remiss to make a video about large language models and AI without talking about the shortcomings. I'm not going to dwell on this too much because so many great articles have been written about it already, but obviously I need to acknowledge the fact that the whole field of AI as it currently stands is incredibly resource intensive. They need a ton of power, to the point that Google have gone back on their pledge to be carbon neutral, and in fact are now talking about building their own nuclear power plants, which is just ludicrous. They use a ton of water, so anywhere that the data centers required to run these calculations is going to be, not only do they need the power, they need the water, which they're going to have to take from local sources, which obviously affects local communities. There is the theft of all the data that went into training it and the disregard for copyright. One other downside that I can see to AI is that if people start flooding the internet with AI generated Glaze recipes, and even worse, AI-generated result photos for those Glaze recipes, the waters are going to become incredibly muddied, and it hasn't begun yet, and I really hope it doesn't start. I was watching something recently about how Pinterest used to be a great place for artists to find pictures to use as reference. Particularly, the artist that I was watching was talking about the human form and how you could find pictures of humans to study the muscle insertions and where the tendons would be if a human was doing a particular activity, because learning the anatomy of a human obviously helps if you're going to create photorealistic art. And Pinterest is flooded with AI slop, and AI does an approximation of all of those things, muscle insertions and tendons and what have you. They're not correct. And any artist trying to use Pinterest for reference for actual human bodies now is unable to, because it is saturated with incorrect information. I really hope this doesn't happen to Glaze. I don't think it will. There's a few more steps to posting that, and I like to think that the community is small enough and curated and moderated enough that won't happen. But if it does, it would be a huge loss. AI is a solution in search of a problem that is using tons of resources, and it is not making the world a better, happier, safer, more equitable place. And so it's very hard to be enthusiastic about it. I'm kind of glad they're no good for Glaze recipes. If they were really effective, there might be some argument for using them, but I am very happy to say that now I've made this video, I will not be going back and asking ChatGPT anything to do with Glaze recipes. And that's pretty much my conclusion on this. They appear capable, They are not capable. I would not recommend them. I would recommend Glaze, and once you have got the hang of making recipes that you found on Glaze, I would recommend Ceramic Materials Workshop and taking a class there and learning to calculate glazes yourself, but I would stay away from anything generated by AI. This video has ended up being longer than I intended. I'd be amazed if anyone stuck around this far, but if you did, thank you for listening. Let me know your thoughts on AI in the comments, if it's been useful for you with Glaze recipes, if you've tried it, did they work, did they not? This is all just my opinion from someone who's mucked around with it. I'm certainly not an expert in that aspect of it. If I've made any mistakes, please feel free to correct me. And yeah, I think that's it. See you in the next video.